I'll tell you something funny about, they made a big hoop holler about like Trump and that old Billy Bush story about, grab him by the whatever. You really, to understand that statement, you gotta look back historically and think about the other presidents. You got old Bill Clinton, and Bill Clinton, to begin with, there was this story. Someone would would go to the Oval Office. They'd, shit, I fucked this joke up already, didn't I? You want to keep going? Let's see. So one of Bill Clinton's followers would knock on the door, and they'd be like, Hey Bill, you seen the new secretary?" Let me channel Bill Clinton here for a second. "Oh well, let me go show. Let's go see that new secretary then." So he and the fellas would go walk over to the secretary pool office. They had a office, nice mahogany door, beautiful mahogany door, wooden door, and he'd say, "Hey, watch this." He'd look at the other guys. He'd go, "Watch this." He'd unzip his zipper. He'd pull his dick out, and he'd open the door, and there's 20, 30, 40 secretaries in there. And he'd walk in, and they'd be like, "Oh, whoa, whoa." They'd all try and stand up, and he'd be like, "Oh, don't get up, don't get up. I'm just here. I just wanted to inspect the secretary pool." And, they'd all be very uncomfortable, but, they weren't going to say anything. So he'd walk over to the new secretary, and he'd stand right behind her, and he'd put both of his hands on her shoulders, and he would purposefully have his dick touch her face. And all the guys watching in the back were laughing their asses off because they had basically ribbed him on into doing it, and he was just doing it to please them. So it's not really his fault. He was just doing what they wanted. Now another historical example is Nixon. Nixon had a very similar story. They would walk up to Nixon, and they'd be like, Have you seen the new secretary?" And he'd be like, let's see let's go inspect the secretary pool. So he'd go over to the same beautiful mahogany door, wooden, ancient, same door as Clinton actually, and he'd be like, "Check this out, watch this," and he'd open the door. It was kind of inspecting the hen house, and he'd walk over, and he'd be like, "Hey, I'm just inspecting, just because I'm the president doesn't mean I'm not responsible for the whole White House. I just like to inspect everything, just keep working like everything's normal," and they'd all pretend to work. And he had a different trick. He didn't do the Clinton trick. He had a different one. He would often carry a pen in his pocket, and he would sort of sneakily drop the pen in front of the desk, and then he would fake falling. Like he'd be like, "Oh, I almost tripped on this pen, lady. You're very klutzy. And, then she'd be like, "Oh, I didn't mean to do that. I'm so sorry. I didn't." And he's like, "Well, I run a very tight ship here. I'm a very professional president. And, I'm a man of law and order. So, he would be like, I'm going to need to, just as a public thing, I'm going to need to make sure you're disciplined." So he would literally publicly spank the secretaries right in front of the other people. And all the guys in the back were just chuckling their asses off because they had basically ribbed him on. And, it wasn't really Nixon's fault. It was kind of the people who egged him on, right? And then, I'm not going to tell you, but, there was Carter. Carter, they'd knock on the door and they'd be like, "Have you seen the new secretary?" And he would literally just lock the door, and you would hear these whipping noises, and people would be like, "Hey, we got a big problem, Carter," and he would the door to the Oval Office would literally be locked, and 30 minutes later, he would open it up, and sometimes you could see a little bit of blood seeping through the back of his suit, and there'd be like a dirty tissue on the ground. No one liked Carter. That was just disgusting. It was just disgusting that he would do that. And, I'm not going to tell you what Reagan did and what Bush did and what, you guys know what JFK did, and you guys probably know what FDR did. I mean, you really can't hold them responsible for what they do. They're pretty degenerate, but then again, the American public's pretty degenerate, so I don't, it's hard to really get really angry about them, because from the crooked tree of humanity, nothing really straight can be created, You really can't expect that much out of them or you, so that's kind of the presidential story.